So guys, after 6 months with the Fuji x100V, I thought it might be appropriate to go through the camera itself and the user experience and what I think about the camera, because I've been using it almost daily for a long time now. But since I've used it quite a bit now, I think I have a little more insight as to say, a better review than just kind of my initial thoughts. So let's get into this camera and I will tell you what I think. Now, before I dive into the specifics of this camera, let me just lay a little bit of groundwork. If you've not watched this channel before, just let me tell you who I am so you kind of get a sense of where I'm coming from. I'm a professional commercial photographer. I've been working professionally for over 30 years. I started obviously in the film days, shooting large and medium format cameras. I spent about 7 years as a wedding photographer. I also spent several years teaching photography and Photoshop at a college level. So I've done a little bit of everything. That's kind of who I am, where I'm coming from. And I bought this camera mainly as a take everywhere I go stock photography camera. That was my intention when I first got this camera. One of the things that I found very interesting about this camera, and this is probably true with a lot of different cameras, but I hadn't experienced it until I got the X100, and I joined a Facebook group, X100 user group on Facebook, and I was amazed at the almost cult-like following that this camera has. Now, I don't say that as a negative thing. People just love this camera, and it's amazing to me to read all the posts and the debates about things that normally I would think are kind of inconsequential. I mean, who cares? But there's debates about, should I get a black one or should I get a silver one? And definitely a lot of talk about, now that I got the camera, what accessory should I get? And people are talking about what color button they should put on the shutter release. And all these things, and which is the best strap and the best case, but it's fun to watch all the little things that people think about this camera outside of just taking photographs with it. They love this camera in a way that I've never seen people love cameras before. So let's start with talking about the lens. 23mm f2 fixed focal length lens. You cannot change the lens on this camera. This is the lens that comes with it. Now there are some converters, ultra wide telephoto converters that you can put on it. I haven't gotten into any of that, but my initial thought with the lens, number one, the images coming out of this camera are super sharp. I don't have any issues with that at all, even at f2. Now 23mm on an APS-C size camera is kind of a mid-range wide angle lens, but even at f2 the depth of field is very shallow. So if that's something that you're into, you certainly can achieve that, especially especially when you're in closer, almost to the point that if you do not get your focus where you need it, it's going to be out of focus. The depth of field is so shallow. So that is super cool. The images coming out of here, like I said, super sharp, not a problem. Now in terms of not being able to change the focal length, not being able to switch lenses, when I first got the camera, I thought that was a little bit of a hindrance because I have a 17-40 on my Canon, and I was used to that super wide angle lens. This was not as wide as what I was used to, so it took a little bit of getting used to the fact that I can't stand only 10 feet away from something that I thought I can still get in the frame. So I've had to learn to back up a little bit, and that's just getting used to it from constant using. As far as not being able to zoom in or zoom out, what I'm finding is it makes me less lazy. I'm moving in, moving out, doing what I need to do, so I don't see it as a restriction in terms of the fact that I only have the one lens. I just am finding myself moving in or out to compensate for that, which I actually think is probably a good thing. The other thing that I have to mention about the lens that I think is a great plus is that when you only have the one lens, that takes one of the variables in your photography out of the mix. There's no more, should I use this lens? Should I use that lens? You don't have that option anymore, and I find myself tending to think about other things more so and concentrate on other things that are important that maybe I would have overlooked had I just been thinking focal length selection. Let's talk about the dials on this camera, the way that it is set up. It's very old school in the sense that the shutter control is right here, the aperture is on the lens itself. The only other thing that's here is the exposure compensation dial, which is fantastic. I personally love all the dials on here. I don't have to go into a menu to change anything. I can just simply look at the camera, set it the way I want it, and it's done. I love that. You know, I don't know if that's just me from, you know, because that's the way I learned, or just the accessibility of all of it is just great. Now, if you are a brand new photographer, you're just learning photography, the fact that all the dials and, you know, adjustments are right here on the lens, on the body, that to me is a great way to learn photography. Far better than, you know, going into a menu or on an LCD screen to change your aperture. This just makes more sense. And in terms of accessories, the shutter release button, the only accessory that I have is this old school cable release, which just screw right into the shutter release button, which it's a little bit more of a novelty than it is a necessity, but that's kind of cool. I find if you're doing a long exposure or something and you don't want to be touching the camera when you fire off the shutter, the 2-second or the 10-second timer is as convenient as the cable release. But, you know, it's kind of a novelty and it's cool that you can do that. Now, in regards to the dials, I think it makes sense to tell you here, as much as anywhere else, how I kind of set the dials up myself. Personally, I set the ISO on automatic. Most of the time, not always, but 90% of the time, I've got that ISO dial on automatic. Now, I've gone into the camera and I've set the limit of that auto ISO at 3200. I don't want the camera to go any higher than that, knowing that the quality of the image is probably going to start breaking down beyond that. I've not really tested it, but at 3200 I found the results to be fantastic. Maybe a little bit of noise in certain cases, easily corrected in Lightroom. And so I've got the auto ISO set at 3200. Everything else I do manually. The shutter speed, you know, I set it to where I want it. The aperture ring, I set that where I want it as I'm going. And I let the auto ISO take care of everything else. Easy, simple. Occasionally I will use the exposure compensation dial if for some reason that meter is getting fooled by a bright sky or a dark something or another, and I can just over or under that really easily. And it's super smooth. Now, when it comes to the auto ISO, I've said this before, but as a film shooter, you never had that option. You always had to choose the speed film that you wanted, put it in your camera, and you were stuck with that film speed. When digital first came into being and everybody switched from film to digital, the quality of the cameras back in those days, you couldn't use super high ISOs. The quality just wasn't there. So, you know, even then I was very conscious of how high of an ISO I went. So to think that I could just trust a camera to put it on auto ISO, that was a little bit of a learning curve for me. I just did it knowing this camera could do it, you know, and I scrutinized the results as I was getting these images back with higher ISOs, and, you know, I was pleasantly surprised how great they looked. So that was something that I had to start kind of rethinking. Don't worry about shooting at 3200. Don't worry about 1600. The images are going to look great. But coming from a film background, knowing that if you got to 800 ISO, 1600 ISO, you were going to have a lot of grain, and a lot of times you chose films like that because that's what you wanted. You wanted a grainy, artsy look. Okay, so let's talk about the LCD screen on the back. When I bought this camera, it was important to me to have a viewfinder, not just a screen in the back. And a lot of cameras at this level, competitors if you will, don't have the viewfinder, they just have the screen. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to look through the camera. But ironically, I find myself just viewing the screen. I end up doing a lot of this kind of thing, you know, watching the screen. It's a touchpad, so a lot of times I will touch where I want it to focus. I find myself doing that a lot. It's helpful, it's great. You know, I've just kind of adapted with the way the camera works. You know, it works great. It wasn't what I intended when I first bought the camera, but it's working great, and I love that. Now, the fact that it flips, you know, it doesn't flip a great deal, but it certainly comes out like this. I find myself doing this more than I thought I would. If I'm shooting really low, rather than trying to crouch down and get, you know, look through it, I will do this kind of thing. And that's super convenient, which is surprising to me. I didn't really think that would be a big deal. As a YouTuber on here, I kind of wish it flipped forward because I think I might use it more for video if it did. but not a big deal. The screen itself is great. I think the quality of the images when you actually look at something, and you can zoom in, you can check focus and exposure pretty well, and it looks really good. Okay, so let's talk about this viewfinder. There is an OVF and an EVF, electronic viewfinder versus optical viewfinder. Now, the way I have mine set up is that when I turn the camera on, if I do not have my eye up to the viewfinder, I'm seeing the image through the screen. As soon as I put my eye up to the viewfinder, I'm looking through the viewfinder and the screen turns off. That seems to work very well for what I do, but I will tell you, the optical viewfinder, I have this on OVF, not EVF. I like the optical viewfinder. There's a white line inside there, so I can tell how it's framed. That's fantastic. I do not need the electronic viewfinder. I don't know, that just doesn't appeal to me. If I was doing a job like a wedding or something where battery life is an issue, using the EVF as I'm looking through there, to me, seems like it would be a huge battery eater. Somebody tell me if that's true or not. But the optical viewfinder I really like. That white line that's there, like I said, that's a great guide for me. I've just trained myself to make sure I'm within that, and I've had great results. But I do like being able to look through it. Even though I find myself just viewing the screen a lot, I think I would miss it if it wasn't there. So let's talk about ease of use. How easy is this camera to use? And I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, 9.8. There's a little bit of a learning curve, if you will, through getting through the menus and learning where all that kind of stuff is at, but that's just, something that you get used to through using it, finding where things are at. So this camera is super easy to use. Like I said, all the dials are right there to be seen. I can't see what would make this camera any easier as far as being able to use it, being able to do what you need it to do. It's just all right there. It's all laid out so nice. It's fantastic. I honestly wish other camera makers would kind of do this old school dial thing on top, because it's just clean, simple, easy to use. Okay, so all of that being said, I think what it really comes down to in the end is the quality of the images. Now, this camera is not going to make you a good photographer in the sense that, you've got to understand lighting and exposure and, being able to compose things. That's kind of on us as a photographer. But as far as the quality of the images coming out of this little camera, for an APS-C size sensor in a little carry everywhere you go camera like this, what I'm finding is the quality of the images are amazing, just stellar. Now, if you side by side a medium format sensor or even a full frame sensor, there's going to be some differences. But for the size of this camera, the quality of the images are fantastic. And I will show you several of them as I'm talking here, but just the quality of the images themselves, the color, fantastic, just awesome. Now, one of the things that this camera does is it has several Fuji film simulations in it, and a lot of people in that Fuji user group are all into what they call the recipes. What film simulation did you use to achieve that look in the photo? I personally have not dived into all those film simulations. I'm not usually somebody who likes to set that in the camera. I shoot raw images, and then anything I want to do to them, I do in the computer later. I don't usually like to pick, a black and white simulation or, something like that, or a classic negative, whatever. So I have not dived into all those film simulations, but I know everybody raves about those, love them, and that's great. I don't have a problem with that. The images, however, coming out of here, stellar. Now, my main push for this camera is still photography. It's not video. However, this does do 4K video, and from what I've seen and what I've used it for, it does a pretty good job. I'm not even going to try to elaborate on that because I'm not a video guy, but what I've seen of it, it does a very good job. It certainly does good enough for the things I do. but you know, somebody who's an expert in video may say differently. I will say this about video though, because this is something that kind of affects me. When you plug in a microphone or any kind of external cord with this camera, like for instance, I have a microphone cord here. The microphone will go up on the hot shoe, no problems. The plug-in is on this right side and goes in there nice and fancy. This goes up to the microphone, no problem. However, if I'm hand holding this as I'm doing video, the cord is coming out on the same side and the little door is open on the same side that I'm going to hold the camera. That makes zero sense to me. I don't know who engineered that, but that is backwards. Every other camera that I've dealt with comes out on this side, so it's not hindering where you're holding it. That just makes zero sense. So Fuji, if you're going to push this as a video camera at all, which maybe you're not, you need to turn that to the other side. And last but not least, the big question outside of how stellar are the images that come off this camera, the question is, does it meet my needs? This camera is about $1,400 brand new. Does it meet my needs? Yeah, absolutely. For what I wanted it for, I wanted a camera that I could take anywhere I go, easy to put in a bag, easy to put in my pocket, take it anywhere I go, but take stellar photographs that are quality enough to give to a client, to send to the stock agencies. Those were the needs that I had for it. Does it meet those needs? Absolutely. I don't regret buying it for a second. Would I buy another one? Maybe. Would I upgrade as soon as the next one comes out? Probably not, because this one is fantastic. I can't think what else that they could put on it that would meet my needs more so than what this one is already doing. If I was a wedding photographer, an event photographer, this thing would probably be in my arsenal. Certainly it's in my arsenal for stock photography. So yeah, it definitely meets my needs and I'm happy with it. Okay guys, I hope that helped a little bit. If there's anything you wanted to know about this camera that I did not mention or did not talk about, feel free to ask me a question in the comments. I would love to hear from you and answer questions that maybe you have. I would definitely love to hear your comments on the camera if you own one yourself. I guess that's about it for now. But the last thing I want to leave you with as far as the Fuji x100V is concerned, I will tell you it is definitely an inspirational camera in the sense of so much fun to use, so easy to use. It just makes you want to get out and take more pictures, which is the point, isn't it? It's what we do. We love to take photographs, and this little camera makes it more exciting to go do that, and I'm always about taking more photographs. So that in itself is probably the biggest advantage of this little camera. But for now, if you haven't subscribed, please do. I appreciate all of you guys. Give me a thumbs up if you would, and I will see you in the very next video. Have a great day, guys.